Welcome, everyone. The topic for today basically is going to be World War II, or more specifically, the events that led up to World War II and America's participation in World War II. World War II is, at least so far, the greatest human catastrophe in the history of the world. You are talking about a situation where between 1939 and 1945, anywhere between 55 to maybe 65 million people were killed. Some say more. It's impossible to get a precise estimate. Uh, the atrocities that were committed during this war, the loss of life, the human suffering, is really incalculable, and it is almost beyond comprehension. In my view, the most terrifying aspect of World War II is the fact that it reveals clearly what human beings are capable of and what human beings will do to other human beings. And that in and of itself is terrifying. We learned, of course, about World War I, which was naively called the war to end all wars. It wasn't. There will never be a war to end all wars unless we have an apocalyptic war that just destroys all life on Earth. Um, as unpleasant and negative as it may sound, the history of planet Earth is also, it's the history of conflict. I mean, it's the history of building. Civilizations are created and people create. And there's certainly a beauty in the world, and there is creativity in the world, and there is technological advancement, and there is progress. But unfortunately, along with that comes human conflict, and sometimes the conflicts are catastrophic in a way that defies description. But I will do my best. So let's talk about the World War II years. I covered the Great Depression and discussed with you the Great Depression and the New Deal. I think it's fair to say that life in the United States and around the world in the 1930s was pretty grim and pretty dire, not a happy time. And if that isn't bad enough, while this is going on and while human beings are suffering due to the Great Depression, the pieces are starting to move that are going to lead to World War II. Whenever there is a major economic crisis, you end up with a political crisis as well. And basically what happened is the seeds of World War II were planted at the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, as another historian said, the Treaty of Versailles is the politics of hatred. And the Treaty of Versailles was about punishment, not peace. And the object of the Treaty of Versailles in the end was not to rebuild Europe in a more just manner, but to punish the Germans. Are the Germans responsible, or at least the German government and the Kaiser, responsible in large measure for World War I? Certainly. But even the victorious powers are not exactly innocent here. I mean, everybody wanted something, which is why they participated in the war in the first place. And the idea of, we're going to just stick it to the Germans, in the end, it would come back to haunt Europe. And even the nations that were on the winning side of World War I, in a way, even though they won, they lost. The Italians technically were on the winning side, but they didn't get what they hoped they would get out of this. And they ended the war basically impoverished as a nation, with terrible economic instability, which led to political instability. And what comes out of that? The rise of dictatorship under Benito Mussolini, who established what today, we call fascism. What is fascism? Fascism is basically totalitarian dictatorship, where you end up with a single leader, a strong leader who promises people whatever they want to hear, and people who are desperate make this, in a way, deal with the devil. People don't have work, people can't feed their families, people are suffering. And a charismatic leader comes along and says, well, if you support me and give me power, I'm going to take care of all this and I'm going to, fix the problems. And desperate people often do this. And in a situation like that, existing governments are not stable enough to resist it. And so, in essence, that's how Benito Mussolini comes to power in Italy. The term fascism comes from ancient Rome. During the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans would carry banners known as a fasces, where it was a symbol of Roman power. And so Mussolini liked that. And of course, the people like Mussolini and Hitler, they have, delusions of grandeur. They want to, they are utterly seduced and corrupted by power. Benito Mussolini's dream is to rebuild the Roman Empire and have Italy as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, just the way the Romans were. In the case of Hitler, he wants revenge for Germany's loss in World War I. He wants revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. And that sounds pretty good to German people who were suffering. Germany ended up with a government after the abdication of the Kaiser known as the Weimar Republic. And they tried to have a democratic government, but it was unable to cope with the nation's problems. And the economy was a total disaster. And that created the environment which allowed for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And the message that Hitler was selling sounded good to desperate people. People were desperate, they were angry. And he basically says, I'm going to rebuild Germany's strength and I'm going to take revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. And we are going to make Germany a great nation, as it should be. And of course, Hitler's ambition also was to have Germany become the dominant power in Europe. And it's very easy when times are bad to tap into people's anger, their hatred, and their prejudice. Within Germany and in much of Europe, the Jewish population was a religious minority. And as a religious minority, they were always viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. They were always viewed by certain members of the population as being other. And so it was very easy for Hitler to tap into that and to say to the German people, well, maybe we would have won the war, but maybe the reason we lost is not really our fault. Maybe, let's blame it on the Jews. And people who were angry and desperate, who already had pre-existing prejudices, sounded good to them. So this is a dark period in human history. And as awful as World War II is, just think about it. From the 1930s, the 1930s are terrible. And then come the 1940s and we have World War II. So I would say that life on planet Earth between, let's say 1930 and 1945, you're talking about a 15-year period where life on this planet is pretty hellish and where human suffering is off the charts. And the thing that scares me about all of it is the idea that, I think it's naive to think that the world could never experience something like that. There were people at the end of World War I who said, this is the war to end all wars. And there were people back then in 1919 and in 1920 who said, World War I was so catastrophic and it was such a disaster and people suffered so much that there's no way that the world can ever experience something like this again. And yet, World War I ended, the shooting stopped in 1918. They had the peace treaty in 1919. And, by 1939, September 1st, 1939, German tanks are rolling into Poland. So it didn't take long for people to learn that just because war is horrible doesn't mean that people are going to stop it from happening. And it really is a period in history, not just for the United States, but for the world, of just pure horror. There's no other way to describe it. In many ways, there are elements of history where it's sort of like a nonstop horror film, and you don't need to make it up because it all happened. America's position during the 1930s is one of isolationism. There was a feeling that, we fought in World War I, and in the end, what did we get out of it? And as the situation around the world deteriorated, I mean, you have the rise of Benito Mussolini in Italy, you have Adolf Hitler in Germany, you have Imperial Japan, which is ruled by a very aggressive Japanese military. And so the world was not made safe for democracy at all. And the ideals of Woodrow Wilson in many ways turned out to be very naive. And the League of Nations simply didn't work. I mean, I don't know that it would have worked if the United States had joined it, but the fact that the United States did not join it guaranteed its failure from the start. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the League of Nations was dead at birth. There's no chance that it was going to work, and it didn't. So this was a very dangerous time. And the United States during this period was very isolationist. We simply, as a nation, did not want to get involved in any foreign conflict. And there was a belief that, what more could we ask for? We have the Pacific Ocean on the West Coast and the Atlantic Ocean on the East Coast, and we'll just go about solving our own problems and minding our own business, and let the rest of the world destroy itself, and we're going to stay out of it. The problem is, as great as that idea sounds, the world is interconnected. We are a part of it. The United States is a nation, even if it wanted to live as if it were an island apart from the rest of the world, it is not apart from the rest of the world. We still have business relationships with other nations. We still engage in trade with other nations. And in the end, as these violent dictatorships began to, attack other parts of the world and threaten other parts of the world, the more this went unchallenged, the greater the threat became to us. And so sooner or later, we're going to have to respond. For people who think that the United States is always eager to get into a war, history suggests otherwise in some areas. I mean, think about it. World War I started in 1914, and we did not enter the war until 1917. World War II really started technically on September 1st, 1939, but we did not enter the war until after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So it isn't like, we're running to look for the next war to jump into. If you look historically, there are many examples where we have tried to avoid getting sucked into conflicts. But in the end, sooner or later, it seems like it happens. World War II was a war that, we had to fight. There's no question. I mean, if you think life on Earth is unpleasant now, I can't even imagine what life on Earth would look like if, God forbid, Hitler had succeeded, or Imperial Japan had succeeded. It's incomprehensible. Winston Churchill, when he became the Prime Minister of England, basically said that if we don't win this, the world is going to enter a new dark age. That is going to be, the Dark Ages Part 2. And I think he was right. I mean, when you really take a close look at what, Hitler was doing and what he wanted to do, and certainly if you look at what life was like in fascist Italy, and if you look at what Imperial Japan did, particularly to the Chinese, I mean, we're talking about behavior that is beyond the pale of any acceptable civilized human conduct. And for me, having studied this material in some detail, the most terrifying part of all of it is the fact that under the circumstances of war, people can behave in a way that is so barbaric and so cruel, uh, that it's almost like there's a rejection of human civilization and what we consider to be civilized human behavior. And there's no other way to describe it. The idea that people can behave in this manner and do some of the things that they did, that human beings can do this. And it isn't like the people who did this were, people who came from backgrounds where they were uneducated, or, they weren't taught, any better. I mean, Germany was one of the most, and it still is, it's one of the most modern, technologically advanced nations in the world. Germany is a country with, culture and music and literature, and yet during this period, they descended into this sort of primal, madness and death, and it's hard to believe. I mean, Japan, by the time we get into the 1930s, I mean, Japan is a modern nation. And yet the behavior and some of the atrocities that were committed in China, particularly in the city of Nanking or Nanjing, depending on how you pronounce it. I mean, it's incomprehensible that human beings can behave in such a savage manner, but they did, and it's very shocking. There's no other way to describe it. I mean, we have a person goes in to a supermarket yesterday and kills 10 innocent people for no reason. And you wonder, like, what is it about humanity that allows for such acts of madness to happen? I don't have an answer to that question. I think that people a lot more intelligent than I am have been asking that question. It's a question that has been asked by historians, philosophers, psychologists, artists, writers. Why do people do these things? And how can we prevent it? And I don't have an answer to that question. I just don't. It is what it is. I mean, I can tell you what happened, but trying to make sense of it is very difficult. And it is very disturbing. And as a father with a 9-year-old son, I'm very worried about this. I don't want him to have to grow up and go through something like World War II. I don't want to have to be afraid that if he goes to the supermarket that someone's going to come in there with a gun. But these fears and anxieties do exist. And when I would teach this class on campus, and I would talk about this after my son was born, I would say to the students, can you make me a promise that when my child grows up, he will never have to fight in a war, or he will not be killed in a war? And no one can make that promise. So, it is what it is. I'm looking at something here. Anyway, so America's position during this period was very isolationist. One of the more famous people who supported American isolationism actually was Charles Lindbergh. And although I respect Charles Lindbergh for his achievement in flying his airplane across the Atlantic, there are many things about Charles Lindbergh that I find very distasteful. He seems to have had a fascination with the idea of genetic superiority and racial superiority, and as a result was somewhat rather enamored with what Germany was doing under Hitler. I don't know that I would go so far as to call him a Nazi, but he certainly was sympathetic to some of their aims. And he was particularly impressed by German air power, because one of the things that happened when Hitler took over was to rebuild the German military and to create, at the time, what was going to be the largest and most modern air force. And I think that Lindbergh was somewhat seduced by the strict sort of law and order that Hitler brought to Germany, and the idea of racial superiority and genetic superiority, and the idea of developing the most modern aircraft. I think that Lindbergh was somewhat seduced by that and tended to ignore or discount the more disturbing aspects of what Hitler was up to. So Franklin Roosevelt really disliked Lindbergh for this. And so Lindbergh is a complicated character, but he was a big supporter. There was back then what was known as the America First Committee that was really active politically and was really lobbying people in government and in the public that we need to stay out of this war. And I don't think people realize, I mean, before the war started, I mean, there were quite more than a few people in this country who were sympathetic to what Hitler was doing. There was a group called the German American Bund, and who wanted to bring Nazi Germany's ideals of racial purity to the United States. I mean, they held a big rally in Madison Square Garden, and Henry Ford himself was sort of viewed as a hero in Henry Ford, I will say, and I can back it up. Henry Ford was very anti-Semitic. He did not like Jews. And he actually, out of his own pocket, paid to have a newsletter printed where he basically railed against Jews, and it's pretty ugly. And part of what Henry Ford wrote, or at least paid to have written, was actually included in the printed American versions of Hitler's Mein Kampf. So there's a lot that people don't know. And they're leading chemists or engineers in the Ford Motor Company, was a leader of an American Nazi organization. So there's a lot of ugliness going on during this period. One of the most terrifying things about racism and prejudice, whether it's hatred of someone because of their color or because of their religion, there are two things I've learned about racism and prejudice and hating someone because of their religion. There are two things I've learned now that I am as of today, 52 years old. There are two things I've learned. One is that being intelligent or well-educated does not give someone immunity to these ideas and thoughts. When I was a child, I used to think that people who were well-educated and intelligent would obviously know better, and that they would understand that disliking somebody because of the group to which they belong, or because of their color or their religion, that educated, intelligent people wouldn't be like that because they would know better. I have discovered that isn't true. That regardless of a person's background, being intelligent and well-educated does not make anyone less likely to have these types of ugly views of other people who are different. And another thing I've learned is that when times are difficult and people are experiencing anxiety or fear, or they're just unhappy, or they're struggling, the human mind, almost like a reflex, looks for someone or something to blame. Where people say, well, my life would be so great if it were not for those people. And then you simply fill in the blank, and you can put whatever group you dislike into that category. And this is a problem that plagues humanity. And in times of conflict and war, it gets worse. And World War II, there is an awful lot of this going on. And sometimes the consequences of it are, frankly speaking, deadly. So this is a terrifying, ugly moment. And imagine how awful it would be. I mean, I know that many of my students are struggling right now. The coronavirus pandemic has been very difficult. There are a lot of people who have anxiety, depression, struggling with money. So, I mean, this has not been an easy time for people, but can you imagine? How would you like to be? I don't know, many of you are, I don't know, 18, 19, 20 years old. How'd you like to be 18 years old in 1939? And you spent your childhood living through the Great Depression, and now you're on the edge of World War II, which is going to be the worst, largest conflict in human history. I mean, imagine what it must have been like for people who were born. Let's say you were born in, 1925, for example, and now it's 1935, and you're 10 years old, and you're struggling to survive as a child during the Great Depression. And then, next thing once you become a young adult, you're off to World War II. And for the women, you get to say goodbye to your father, or you get to say goodbye to your brother or your husband, not knowing if you're ever going to see them again. For the generation that lived through, this is a generation that lived through back to back crises. I mean, as if the Great Depression wasn't enough of a challenge to endure. Just imagine what it must have been like for these people to have to live through the Great Depression and World War II back to back. When you really stop and think about it, it's extraordinary that anyone could survive this with their mental health intact. And of course, many didn't. I mean, even those who came through it suffered from mental health issues, which in those days people did not talk about or treat the way we would be more open about that today. So America's position in this period is very much isolationist. And President Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, he's not a fool. I mean, he sees what's going on. He realizes the danger. He referred to Germany, Italy, and Japan during that time. He called them the three bandit nations. The League of Nations was utterly ineffective and did nothing. And even before World War II officially started, when Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, I mean, anyone could see what was coming. I mean, it was clear, where this was going, even before Germany invaded Poland. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, I mean, he wants to rebuild the Roman Empire, so he wants to control the Mediterranean and he wants to control North Africa. The Italians under Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And what did the League of Nations do about it? Nothing. They had meetings, they talked, but nothing happened. Mussolini was allowed to get away with it. When you're confronted by a bully, you have to respond immediately and make it clear that you're not going to be bullied and you're going to fight back, because if you don't, it's just going to get worse and worse. And that's exactly what happened. So Benito Mussolini invaded, Italy invaded Ethiopia and got away with it. Hitler basically ignored the Treaty of Versailles, and he rebuilt Germany's military. And there is an area near the border between Germany and France called the Rhineland. And one of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was that the Rhineland would be demilitarized. In other words, that Germany would not have military forces in that region. And Hitler said, well, the hell with that, and sent German troops into the Rhineland, and the League of Nations did nothing. England and France did nothing. And he realized very quickly that, they were so scared of him that they were not going to stand up to him, that he could do what he wanted. And, the message was clear. If you say, I'm going to draw a red line, and that red line gets crossed, but then you don't follow through on responding, then, the game's over. Then, your red lines mean nothing. And that's exactly what happened here. So the Treaty of Versailles was violated, and the European powers allowed it to happen, and they didn't do anything about it. Italy invades Ethiopia, nothing's done. And then Japan invades China, Japan is a modern industrial nation. They want to be the dominant empire in Asia, and they need raw materials in order to do that. They need access to to oil and to iron ore to make steel. They need raw materials to maintain this military machine. Japan as a nation itself has very limited natural resources. So what do? They invade China and they conquer a region called Manchuria. And again, the League of Nations does nothing. And the brutality of this was extreme. So it's very clear where we're headed here. It's sort of like watching fires break out and you just hope that they don't blow in your direction and burn your house down. But nothing was done to stop it at the beginning. And then, of course, we have what I consider to be the greatest, one of the greatest humiliations of modern times. Hitler was making threats against Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a new nation that was created after World War I. And there is a region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. And the population of the Sudetenland is largely Germanic. They're not Slavic people, they're Germanic people. And Hitler believed in, the idea of, Germanic racial superiority. And he wanted that region, the Sudetenland, to become part of this new German empire he wanted to build called the Third Reich. And so he's threatening the territory of a sovereign nation. And there was an emergency meeting that was held in the German city of Munich. And Hitler, of course, is there, and Mussolini is there. And, the prime minister of, the president of France is there, and the prime minister of England is there. And what they basically do is they stab Czechoslovakia in the back. They sell them out. It's like throwing your friend to a shark, hoping that the shark will not eat you. And so Neville Chamberlain, who is the prime minister of England at this time, they basically do a deal and they say to Hitler, look, tell you what, we'll let you take this territory, the Sudetenland, if you promise that that's it. And you can take it, if you promise that you're not going to ask for anything more and you're not going to do anything else and you're not going to threaten anybody, and this will satisfy you. And Hitler says, sure, of course, where do you want me to sign? And so Czechoslovakia was left defenseless. And the Germans took this territory, the Sudetenland, and Neville Chamberlain lands back in London, and he takes out this piece of paper and he goes, look at this piece of paper. I signed it and Hitler signed it. And you know what this piece of paper means? It means that we have peace in our time. Isn't that wonderful? And the crowd is there and everybody clapped and said, hooray. I mean, it's madness. This is what happens when you are so desperate to believe something that you make yourself believe it even when it is not true. That's what this is. Historians refer to this is known as appeasement. What does appeasement mean? Appeasement basically means you are threatened by a bully and you give the bully whatever the bully wants, hoping that they will leave you alone. And history has made it very clear it never works. It just doesn't work. It didn't work then. It's sickening. I mean, basically, England and France, they stabbed Czechoslovakia in the back and they sold them out, hoping they'd save their own skins. And in the end, they didn't. While this was going on, Winston Churchill was not in power as Hitler was coming to power. And Winston Churchill went on, he would go on the radio, wonderful speaker, and he tried to sound the alarm and he tried to give a warning. And he said, look, this is a threat and this threat is real. And if we do not prepare to respond to defend ourselves from this threat, we're going to be in real trouble. And of course, people at the time said, "Oh, you're trying to scare us, and you want war, and you don't believe in peace, and you're a warmonger, and all the rest." Well, in the end, he was right all along. But unfortunately, nobody wanted to listen to him until it was too late. Another thing that Hitler does, Hitler, by the way, was born in Austria, which is also a Germanic country, and they speak German. And what Hitler wants to do in the beginning is he wants to build a united German empire, uniting all German-speaking people in Europe in one empire. That's what the Third Reich is all about. So he marches his troops into Vienna, into Austria, and says, Austria is now going to be part of the Third Reich. He takes the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia with the approval of England and France. And then a short time after that, he says, we're already in the Sudetenland. Why don't we just take the rest of the country? And then he takes his military and says, let's just take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And he sends his tanks into Prague. And what is the world reaction to this? What does the world do? Nothing. So here we are. It's 1938. We're heading into 1939. And Hitler has taken control of Austria. He has violated the Treaty of Versailles. He has rebuilt Germany's military. He has reoccupied the Rhineland. He has taken the Sudetenland, and then goes on to take the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the world does not respond to this at all. Winston Churchill made a comment that he felt that his nation had suffered a defeat without having even fired a single shot in defense or protest. And so this is just, it shows you what happens when you have weak leadership. I think that weakness is the greatest danger that can lead to war because there's no deterrence. There's a story at the Munich conference where Neville Chamberlain shows up and he's wearing a business suit. He's got his hat on, he's carrying an umbrella, and he looks like, I'll make fun of myself. He looks like an old college professor ready to do a lecture rather than a statesman who was ready to confront a problem. And he wasn't taken seriously from the beginning. Neville Chamberlain wasn't a bad man. He was a decent man. But the problem with a decent man like Neville Chamberlain, the problem with good people is they have a very hard time comprehending bad people. And there was an important member of the British government, Lord Halifax, who made a comment that diplomacy would have been much easier if Herr Hitler had gone to Oxford. And I guess what they decided to do was let's pretend he had. And they're engaged in this self-delusion where they're going to pretend that they are dealing with a normal situation and a normal head of state, rather than a totalitarian dictator who is utterly ruthless, bent on domination, and preparing for war. They could not or would not allow themselves to believe the reality of the threat, that the reality of the threat was so horrible that they pretended it wasn't real. Until, of course, once the bombs started falling, they found out otherwise. And it's unbelievable. And it's funny, I mean, this is before my time. I wasn't alive then, but I've studied this in detail. And, I study it and it angers me even now. I look at this and I just want to go back in time, and I want to take Neville Chamberlain, by the shoulders and shake him and say, do you understand what you're dealing with here? Do you understand who this guy is? Do you understand that there is no piece of paper that you are going to sign that is going to stop him from what he wants to do? And there is nothing you are going to do that's going to guarantee peace? It's unbelievable. And of course, what they did to Czechoslovakia is shameful, absolutely shameful. And in the end, it didn't protect them anyway. So this is a bad time. And while this is going on, the United States is completely isolationist. We want no part of any of it. I think Franklin Roosevelt understood that sooner or later this fire will spread and we will have no choice. But he also understood that the American public was not behind him. They wanted no part of this. In addition to everything I've already told you, something that doesn't really get enough attention, in my view, in the history books, is something called the Spanish Civil War. Um, there was a general in Spain, General Francisco Franco, who was a fascist, who overthrew a democratically elected government in Spain, and he wanted to become the ruler of Spain. The Spanish Republic was, generally speaking, a left-wing government, and Franco was very right-wing, but he also wanted to become the ruler of Spain, and so Spain engaged in a civil war in the 1930s. During that time, Hitler was building up his own military and provided assistance to General Franco in Spain, and offered to use German power to help Franco win. And one of the things that Hitler wanted to do with his new air power was to test it. So German bombers attacked a town in Spain called Guernica, and bombed this town into the dirt, killing the civilian population. It's utterly ruthless. There is a very famous painting by the great artist Pablo Picasso called Guernica, which is a very disturbing work of art, which illustrates the horror of what occurred there. And I hate to say it, but what happened at Guernica was simply a preview of coming attractions, because cities all over Europe are going to be bombed in this way. During the war, London is going to be bombed in what becomes known as the Blitz. Of course, once the Americans join the war, we're going to retaliate. We're going to bomb German cities. We're going to bomb Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin. And by the time the war is over, cities are going to become bombed out ruins in which millions of civilians will be killed. In World War II, once we gained the upper hand against Japan and Asia, we started firebombing Japan. I mean, we firebombed Tokyo and incinerated anywhere between 70 to 90,000 people in one night. War, the Civil War general, the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, basically said, war is hell, war is cruelty, and there's no point in trying to pretend it's anything else. And he was correct in that. So, this is a tough period. The United States, during this period, excuse me, the United States during this period passes a series of neutrality laws where we basically say we are not going to be selling weapons to anybody. We are not going to be shipping weapons to anybody. We are not going to engage in any behavior or activity that threatens to drag us into another conflict. But in the end, Roosevelt realizes that this is not going to work. And once Hitler is on the move and the war is on, the Neutrality Acts were amended so that we could produce weapons to prepare for war. Our initial policy in terms of providing weapons to England, for example, was a policy called cash and carry. And what that meant was that we're going to say to England, you want American weapons? Fine, you can have them, but you're going to have to pay in cash. And you're going to have to pick them up and deliver them yourself. We're not going to send them to you on American ships. And in the end, that would prove inadequate because England is very quickly running out of money. They are fighting for their survival, and they're simply not going to be able to do this. So later, Roosevelt uses all of his political skill to get Congress to pass something called Lend-Lease. What is that? What is Lend-Lease? Um, England didn't have the money for weapons and they needed them to survive. And Roosevelt understood that if England goes down, then we are very much at risk. So Lend-Lease basically is we will lend England the weapons. And so here's how Roosevelt explained it. He says, look, imagine that your neighbor has a fire and they run over to you and say, I need to use your garden hose to put out the fire. Well, as a good neighbor, you let them use the garden hose and put the fire out. And when they're done, they bring the hose back. Well, that sounds great, but I mean, it made no sense. I mean, what were the English going to do? Return the shot down planes to us and the blown up tanks and the ships that were sunk? But this was a way of Roosevelt kind of using his charm and political skill to try to sell this. So it's we tried to help keep England alive during this period, and it was very difficult. I mean, once the war was on, France fell very quickly. By 1940, France is knocked out of the war. I'll talk more about that next time, but it was an utter humiliation for France. And then England started to be bombed, and this was bad news, bad news. So what I want to do is I want to show you a little video about what led up to this period. A video that's going to show you what is going on just before the fighting really starts. And then we'll call it a day, and then I'll, on my next lecture, talk about the war itself and America's entry into the war. So I will use my screen sharing feature. So bear with me because I always seem to have trouble with it. I'm not going to show you this whole video, just part of it.
One of the goals of the treaty was to break up the four empires of Europe. 9 countries were given new boundaries and independence. As a result of the remapping, Germany lost territory to its surrounding countries. The treaty demanded Germany accept full blame for World War I and pay huge sums of money called reparations to the victorious nations. Germany was also stripped of much of its military power and forced to demilitarize the area near the border of France, known as the Rhineland. The intention of the Treaty of Versailles was largely to punish Germany for World War I, but also to create new democracies and self-determination in Europe. But huge war debts, hunger, and unemployment made it difficult for some democracies to flourish. In the end, the treaty that was meant to secure a lasting peace for Europe had, in effect, laid the groundwork for war. In Russian, Stalin means man of steel. The Soviet Union's communist leader Joseph Stalin certainly lived up to his name. During his rule, the Soviet Union achieved unprecedented power, but at the cost of freedom for its people. He launched a brutal transformation of Soviet agriculture through collectivization, forcibly taking over privately owned land, creating a system of state-owned farms. He also took control of manufacturing and production, creating huge government-controlled industries. Stalin created a police state in which anyone who disagreed with the government's policies could be arrested and sent to labor camps in Siberia. In 1930, Stalin began the Big Purge. So-called enemies of the people were arrested and executed. Historians estimate between 8 to 13 million people were killed. By 1939, Stalin had firmly established a totalitarian communist government with complete control over its citizens. All opposition was crushed. In Italy, similar events unfolded shortly after World War I. In 1919, dictator Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, or the Chief as he was called, began his rise to power. Mussolini became popular because he promised Italians he would rebuild Italy and create a new Roman Empire. Mussolini created a political movement called fascism, and in 1921 he became a member of the Italian parliament. In 1922, he and thousands of his fascist supporters, known as the Black Shirts, marched into Rome, demanding the Italian king give him power to lead the government. Not wanting to start a civil war, the king conceded. Mussolini was sworn in as prime minister in October. Like Stalin, Mussolini crushed any and all opposition to his totalitarian regime. At the end of World War I, Adolf Hitler was just another jobless soldier wandering around Germany. In 1919, he joined a small political party called the National Socialist German Worker, the Nazi Party. Like communists in the Soviet Union and fascists in Italy, the Nazis practiced an extreme form of nationalism, believing that the interests of their country were more important than any others, even more important than personal rights and freedoms. Hitler quickly rose to power to become the Nazi Party's leader, or Führer. In his 2-volume book Mein Kampf, My Struggle in English, Hitler spelled out his Nazi beliefs. He sought to unite all German-speaking people into a national state. He also maintained that the German or Aryan race was superior to all others. Hitler thought his master race deserved more land, even if it meant taking it by force. The economic hardships in Germany in the early 1930s helped Hitler and the Nazi Party gain power. In 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were jobless, and Hitler's promise to restore German pride and stature in the world appealed to them. As head of the Nazi Party, Hitler was appointed German Chancellor in January 1933. He quickly put an end to the faltering Weimar democracy and established his Third Reich, a totalitarian regime with himself as dictator. Hitler capitalized on hate and racism, blaming Jews for the economic problems plaguing Germany. Jews were ousted from government positions and certain professions, and barred from the use of public facilities. They were isolated and forced to wear a yellow Star of David. The discrimination escalated in November of 1938. Rampaging mobs attacked Jews in the street, in their homes, and at their places of work and worship. Nearly 100 Jews were killed, more than 1,000 synagogues burned, and over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. This came to be called Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. Jewish property was seized, and Jews, Gypsies, and other groups considered unfit for Hitler's master race were sent to concentration camps. Over the course of the war, 6 million Jews and 5 million others were murdered by the Nazis. This became known as the Holocaust. The extent of the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps would not be fully realized until the war ended in 1945. Though the young Emperor Hirohito led Japan, the true power during the 1930s was in the hands of the Japanese military. The country was gripped in a frenzy of nationalism, and like Germany and Italy, desired more land and resources for its growing population. In a surprise attack, September 1931, Japan invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria. Japan saw Manchuria as the first step in its desire for domination of China. The League of Nations, established to help keep peace after World War I, condemned Japan's invasion, but did nothing to stop it. In turn, Japan simply quit the League. By 1936, the clouds of war encircled the globe. Germany and Italy formed an alliance they described as an axis around which Europe would revolve. 4 years later, Japan would join the Axis powers, and together, the three countries pledged to aid each other in the event of attack. The extreme political philosophies that emerged during these troubled times appealed to many people worn down by economic hardship. But the overly patriotic beliefs of nationalism, the acceptance of totalitarianism, the militant and racist fascist beliefs of the Nazis, and the communist doctrines of state-controlled property and government all contributed to a worldwide war. 1935, Benito Mussolini sought to distract the Italian people from their troubles at home by creating a war abroad. Claiming Ethiopia as their territory, the Italian military invaded the African country, easily defeating the poorly equipped nation. The following year, civil war erupted in the democracy of Spain between forces loyal to the government and those supporting fascist dictator Francisco Franco. The United States and the Soviet Union supported the loyalists, while Germany and Italy aided the fascists. These alliances were a preview of the coalitions that would form during World War II. Meanwhile, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Adolf Hitler began to rebuild the German military. He remilitarized the Rhineland with a series of defenses along the border of France. The League of Nations did nothing to respond to Hitler's enormous buildup of military might. Emboldened, on March 12, 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, marching over the border and occupying the country with a full-scale invasion. He then demanded Czechoslovakia surrender control of the Sudetenland. Once part of Germany, the Sudetenland was remapped as a territory in Czechoslovakia after World War I. Hitler believed it was the right of the Germans to take this land back. Britain and France had to respond to Hitler's aggression, but they faced a difficult decision. Rather than risk another war with Germany, they signed the Munich Agreement, forcing Czechoslovakia to relinquish the Sudetenland to the Germans. In return, Hitler promised that this would be his last territorial demand. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, felt appeasement of Hitler was a victory and received a hero's welcome when he arrived home.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Not all Englishmen agreed that appeasement was a victory. Winston Churchill, Chamberlain's eloquent political rival and later Prime Minister, chastised Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister. The policy of appeasement failed. Germany soon took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. In August of 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, vowing they would never attack each other. The pact between these two powers shocked the rest of the world. Stalin, though he hated the Nazis, signed to avoid war. But the non-aggression pact also contained a secret agreement, which allowed the Soviet Union territorial control of the eastern half of Poland and the Baltic states in the event of a war. Later, Stalin would learn a bitter lesson. Treaty or not, Hitler could not be trusted. Despite the troubling hostilities across the Atlantic, most Americans remained staunchly against involvement in any overseas struggles. Since the 1920s, America had steered a course of isolationism, staying out of foreign affairs. The Great Depression and the economic, social, and political turmoil it caused domestically contributed to the belief that Americans should concentrate on solving America's problems. In 1928, the U.S. signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact and were eventually joined by 61 other nations in a pledge to never make war again. By 1930, rumors spread claiming that bankers and munitions dealers, anxious to turn a quick profit, had dragged the United States into World War I. Congressional hearings ensued. They found that huge amounts of money had in fact been made by these so-called merchants of death. The American public's outrage only added to the anti-war sentiment. Clearly, Americans had no taste for another war.
In the event of war in Europe, I think we should stay out of it entirely. All our efforts should be made to keep out of the fight.
Let Europe fight their own battles. They mean nothing to us.
This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was well aware of the country's feelings. In 1935, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, stopping the sale of arms or loans of money to nations at war. But by 1937, Roosevelt found it increasingly difficult to support isolationism. When Japan again invaded China in July of 1937, FDR ignored the Neutrality Acts, sending arms to aid China. Flooded with protests accusing him of leading America into war, FDR backed off, while tensions mounted in Europe and Asia.
I have been compelled to contrast our peace with very different scenes that are being enacted in other parts of the world.
In contrast to the turbulent events occurring overseas, America was at peace. The country was climbing out of the Great Depression, and people were beginning to again enjoy the fruits of a prosperous society. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler ordered his troops into Poland. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, dropped a torrent of bombs on Poland's cities, while German tanks rolled across the countryside. It was the first use of the German military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, a new and devastating offensive that exploited new advances in tanks, artillery, and air power. Two days later, both Britain and France declared war on Germany. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. World War II had begun. Despite the declarations of war, the next few months saw only an ominous calm settle over the Maginot Line, a labyrinth of defense fortifications along the eastern border of France. French, British, and German troops waited for something to happen. Many began to call this the phony war. As the months passed, however, the Nazis were planning their next acts of aggression. Beginning in April of 1940, the Nazis began their conquest of Western Europe. In a massive demonstration of Blitzkrieg, they invaded Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. The Germans ultimately set their sights on the conquest of France. French, British, and Belgian troops were stationed along the entire border of France, including the Maginot Line, though they left one area vulnerable, the Ardennes Forest. The French military believed that the heavily wooded area would be impenetrable to German forces. They were wrong. Hitler sent his tanks smashing through the Ardennes forest into France, effectively cutting off opposition forces. British and French troops were overwhelmed by the German military offensive into France and retreated to the French coastal town of Dunkirk. Pinned to the sea, hundreds of thousands of troops were trapped. Surrounded by the Nazis, the soldiers seemed doomed. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill appealed for help. Soon, British Navy and civilian boats of all sizes and shapes emerged to form a makeshift flotilla. In less than a week, fishermen, grocers, tugboat captains, anyone with a seaworthy vessel ferried roughly 340,000 troops to safety across the English Channel. Their heroics saved the soldiers, but they couldn't save Paris. On June 21, 1940, the French capital fell to the Nazis. Hitler dictated his terms of surrender to the French government. Germany had succeeded in conquering Western Europe. Only Great Britain remained. The British people, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, were defiant.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing ground, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
Undeterred by Churchill's rhetoric, Hitler pressed on. In the Battle of Britain, the German Luftwaffe was ordered to bomb England. Between June and September of 1940, German planes pounded British targets. On just one evening alone in mid-August, over 1,000 Luftwaffe bombers invaded the skies over England. Germany soon began concentrating her air fury on the city of London. Londoners found refuge from the Blitz in air raid shelters and underground train stations. Frightened parents sent children out of the city to friends and relatives in the countryside. The attacks were relentless, but despite the overwhelming number of German planes, Great Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF, fought back courageously. Using newly developed radar technology, the British were able to detect Luftwaffe planes coming over the English Channel. Early warning stations were set up along the English coast to detect the enemy and pinpoint German planes in the sky. On September 15, 1940, the RAF shot down the most German planes in a single day of battle. Defeated, Hitler called off his invasion for the time being. Addressing the British people, Winston Churchill gave thanks.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
But bravery alone could not win the war. Britain was crippled, with no more resources to build the planes and ships needed to withstand Germany's next attacks. Winston Churchill turned to America and FDR for help. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was re-elected to a third term as president, the only American president ever to serve more than 2 terms. Roosevelt would not commit troops to the overseas battlefield, but he vowed to help the British in their life-or-death struggle against Hitler's regime.
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations. Our most useful and immediate role is to act as an arsenal for them as well as for ourselves.
With FDR's urging, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Plan, which allowed him to lend or lease arms and other supplies to any country whose defense was vital to the United States. Not all Americans were united in their support of the president, however. Charles Lindbergh, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927, was a staunch opponent of America's involvement in the war.
We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other peoples to lead our country to destruction.
Despite opposition from Lindbergh and others, the Lend-Lease Act was funded with $7 billion. By the time World War II was over, the bill would total $50 billion. 2 years after making a non-aggression pact with Stalin, Adolf Hitler turned his hostilities towards the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1941, he boldly ordered 3 million German soldiers to invade Russia. Stalin was outraged by Hitler's betrayal, and Russia joined in the fight against Hitler, becoming an ally of the West, if only for the duration of the war. Hitler hadn't counted on the harshness of the Russian terrain and the bravery of the Russian soldiers. Military resistance and brutal winter weather took a toll on the Germans, and their invasion ground to a weary halt. America now sent Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union as well as to Great Britain. But for American aid to help either nation, shipping lines across the Atlantic Ocean had to remain open. Hitler's submarines prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, torpedoing supply ships. FDR ordered the Navy to protect all Lend-Lease shipments and allowed American warships to attack German submarines in self-defense. In July 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill finally met face-to-face in Argenta Bay, off Newfoundland. They agreed to issue a joint declaration on the goals of the war. Their agreement, the Atlantic Charter, became the basis for a new document called a Declaration by the United Nations, spelling out the ground rules for countries opposing the Axis powers. 26 countries eventually signed on and became known collectively as the Allied powers. In the same month that Churchill and Roosevelt were meeting in the Atlantic, the Japanese were escalating their aggressions in the Pacific. Japan seized French Indochina, causing President Roosevelt to declare an embargo on goods being sent to Japan, including oil. Japan badly needed oil to defend herself from enemies or to wage war. Relations with Japan became even more strained. The United States demanded Japan leave the Axis powers and withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan's military leaders assured Emperor Hirohito they would make one more attempt to avoid war with the United States. But as Japan's peace envoy flew to Washington, D.C. for talks on November 5, 1941, the Japanese military prepared for an attack on America. 1 month later, on December 6th, FDR was shown an intercepted message sent to the Japanese negotiators, telling them to reject all American peace proposals. It was obvious. War with Japan was inevitable. December 7th dawned bright and sunny over the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. But shortly before 8 a.m., terror struck from the sky. Launching a surprise attack, over 300 Japanese warplanes bombed and torpedoed the base at Pearl Harbor. 200 aircraft were destroyed and 20 ships sunk or damaged. By the time it was over, 2,400 Americans were dead, over 1,100 wounded, and the entire Pacific Fleet crippled.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves.
The raid on Pearl Harbor caused more damage to the U.S. Navy in personnel and equipment than all the losses suffered during the entire First World War. 3 days later, Germany and Italy supported Japan by declaring war on the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked and enraged the American people. The time for isolation was clearly over. Now it was time for unity. Now it was time to fight. America's massive investment in ships, tanks, and the materials of war would bring an end to the Great Depression. It would also help unify a people through patriotism and sacrifice. The story of America's involvement in World War II continues in Part 2, The World at War.
All right, everybody. I think between my lecture, and that's a very good sort of, that I like that video because it summarizes everything very, very neatly. So that's all I have to say for today. Unless anyone has any questions, you are free to go.